All right, well, thanks to the Federalist Society and the local chapter for inviting me to learn about Originalism 2.0. The title makes me curious, leading me to ask some questions. What was wrong with the previous version? Why didn't I get any of these software updates? And will there be an Originalism 3.0 that eliminates all the bugs from 2.0? I'd like to make 3 points today. First, to answer the question that the panel is supposed to discuss, originalism is not merely a tool that favors conservative or libertarian policies. It can be applied in a principled manner without merely or necessarily generating results that folks like Tom DeLay or Ron Paul favor. Having said that, even though originalism can be applied in a principled manner, like every theory of interpretation, it will often be used as a tool to justify someone's preferences. People grasping for support for their preferences will be tempted to claim that the Constitution's original meaning reflects their favored policy. So the answer, I think, to the question posed to the panel is yes to both parts of the question. It is both a principled theory, but also something that is used to justify political outcomes in a sometimes unprincipled way. And then my third point is that theories of the living Constitution practically invite people to read their preferences into the Constitution because such theories do not contemplate any fixed meanings. Under a living constitutional theory, no constitutional claim is forever mistaken or wrong-headed. The most that can be said is that a claim is wrong today. Stay tuned to the winds of hopes and stay tuned and see what the winds of hope and change bring tomorrow. So first, can originalism be principled? Is it just a tool for conservative politics? And I think the answer is of course not. It's just a familiar methodology of interpretation. If you want to understand what an utterance or document means, you try to understand what the speaker or author was trying to convey. This is what we do in everyday conversations and letters and emails. And this seems to be a foundation of communication, an attempt to understand what other people are trying to convey to us. I think this may sound controversial to lawyers, but I think this is how people understand each other and history more generally. So if you want to understand what President Washington meant in his farewell address by warning against entangling alliances, you will need to understand his policy preferences, the nation's circumstances when he was resigning, and what the words would have meant at the time. If you want to know what Dr. King meant when he talked about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, you'll want to understand his perspective, his philosophy, and his struggle for racial justice. And if you want to make sense of what my mother means when she tells me to go get some Kellogg's from the store, you've got to realize that for her, Kellogg's is just a synonym for cereal. And so I can go get Post or Quaker or what have you. It's not really a reference to a particular cereal. So it seems to me that originalism is not a handmaiden of the RNC or the Tea Party movement, or for that matter, the members of the Federalist Society. As a methodology, originalism can be applied to any utterance or document and help supply a meaning, apply the doctrine either 1.0 or 2.0 to the Soviet Constitution, and I suspect that the results would be rather unappealing to most of you gathered today. Apply the doctrine to understand the meaning of Roe versus Wade, and you get a meaning that is relatively clear and anathema to those who are opposed to abortion. If what I'm saying is true, why is originalism so closely identified with conservatives and libertarians? Probably because the original Constitution is generally understood to create a somewhat limited sphere for the federal government with express protections for contracts, property, and participation in political discourse. Given the sense that the Constitution expressly incorporates at least some preferences held by conservatives and libertarians, it is hardly surprising that it has come to be associated with related movements. Hence, though originalism is not inherently conservative, in a world with a conservative libertarian constitution, its most vocal defenders often will be conservatives and libertarians. Yet we cannot forget that in a world with a communist constitution full of paeans to statism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, we might find the communists are the most ardent originalists and free market devotees among the most more vocal opponents of originalism. So having defended originalism as a theory, let me rather abruptly switch gears and criticize some of its adherents. Let us admit, as we must, that purported or supposed originalism arguments are often nothing more than an attempt to use the Constitution or the Founding Fathers as a tool in contemporary political disputes. Conservatives and libertarians, especially in the political realm, often do make claims about what the Constitution means and what the Founders wanted, claims that often merely reflect their own desires and what they hope to find in the Constitution. So if you favor the president's military measures, whatever they might be, you emphasize that he and only he is the commander-in-chief, and hence it seems to follow that Congress can't interfere, as if this were the only logical implication of the text and its original understanding. If you like the filibuster, because you don't like the legislation that's being considered, emphasize deliberation and the Constitution's checks and balances, thereby suggesting a constitutional patina for the filibuster. But this use of the Constitution for instrumentalist purposes is inevitable on all sides of the political spectrum. I recall Justice Scalia saying on one of his many trips to law schools, he borrowed from a pasta commercial that was then prevalent on the TV. You want something in the Constitution, it's all in there. Abortion rights, nude dancing, whatever you want. So great is the temptation to use constitutional argument for political gain that even opponents of originalism can't help themselves. For decades, perhaps the most frequent reason cited by non-originalists in opposition to presidential war-making was that the founders sought to vest exclusive war-making power in Congress. We cannot have the president starting wars willy-nilly because James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and many others said that the presidents couldn't initiate conflict. My former colleague Mike Ramsey made this very point several years ago and pointed out the seeming contradiction between some people's distaste for originalism, but their willingness to make originalist arguments when it suited their purposes. But this opportunistic use of originalism by non-originalists is not limited to war powers. Indeed, one of the most common arguments against presidential powers during the Bush administration was the claim that the Constitution was not simply meant to grant the president broad powers because the founders were repudiating George III and his more absolutist Stuart predecessors. For instance, the ABA Committee's report on signing statements is replete with statements to this effect, so much so that one would be excused for supposing that the members were devout devotees of originalism. It would seem that the constitutional understandings of dead white males can be cited as a means of opposing the actions of a living white one. This is not to say that critics of presidential power are particularly hypocritical or that conservatives and libertarians don't fall prey to the similar temptations. Everybody can give into their frailties and come to believe the seductive illusion that the Constitution just is whatever they wish to find in it. Having criticized both non-originalists and originalists and their originalist claims, let me move to a criticism of the living constitutional theory. The tendency to find whatever one wishes in the Constitution, a tendency we all share, seems to me exacerbated by non-originalist theories that proclaim, indeed celebrate, the notion that constitutional meaning changes over time. What do I mean by this? Well, if the Constitution does not mean today what one wishes to find in it, just push one's preferences, gather a coalition of strong voices, and eagerly await the day when one's preferences are eventually constitutionalized. That is to say, living constitutional theories do not, it seems to me, ever wholly deny constitutional gratification. They just merely delay it. What is constitutional today may not be constitutional tomorrow. What is constitutionally forbidden today may be permissible for your children. Indeed, living constitutional theories will encourage people to make what may seem at the time outrageous claims about the Constitution because the repetition of such claims makes them more plausible and makes it easier to bend the Constitution in the direction preferred by constitutional entrepreneurs. Given this tendency, it seems clear to me at least that living constitutional theories cannot serve at all as a meaningful check on the constitutional claims of living constitutional adherence, for the very idea of a fixed point in meaning is contradictory to the first principles of those who believe in a living constitution. So if originalism is to be criticized as merely reflecting conservative preferences, any fair criticism of it must be a comparative one, comparative to other theories of constitutional interpretation. So I would ask you, an unbiased audience, which theory is more enticing to those who cannot avoid the temptation of reading their own preferences into the Constitution? One which contemplates right and wrong answers for all time, or one which doesn't? Thank you.